Caregiving can sometimes feel like an impossible struggle. Caregivers may be torn between taking care of loved ones and trying to maintain balance in life. The good news is that it doesn't have to be that way. The Caring Generation with host Pamela D Wilson is here to focus on the conversation of caring. You're not alone. In fact, you're in exactly the right place to share stories and learn tips and resources to help you and your loved ones. So now, please welcome the host of The Caring Generation, Pamela D Wilson.
This is Pamela D Wilson, caregiving expert, speaker, consultant, and guardian of the Caring Generation. The Caring Generation focuses on the conversation of caring, giving us permission to talk about aging, the challenges of caregiving, and everything in between. It's no surprise that needing care or becoming a caregiver changes everything. The Caring Generation is here to guide you along the journey to let you know that you're not alone. You are in exactly the right place to share stories and learn about caregiving programs and resources to help you and your loved ones plan for what's ahead. Invite your parents, spouses, family, friends, colleagues, coworkers, everyone you know to listen to the show, available on podcast apps worldwide. If you have a question or an idea for a future program, share your idea with me by commenting on my social media posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also go to my website, PamelaDWilson.com, click on the Contact Me button, and complete the caregiver survey. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into 3 emotional scenarios about caregiving and family relationships to answer the question, how does caregiving affect family relationships? Number 1. What happens when the support provided by anyone, an adult child, a grandchild, moves past the early stages of helping out? When a husband or a wife, an adult child, a grandchild helps, and they don't really recognize that their, quote, help or their participation is as a caregiver. Until somebody in a healthcare profession like a doctor or a nurse says, oh, you're the caregiver for your mom. You're the caregiver for your uncle. You're the caregiver for your grandparent. And then these people are thinking, caregiver? What the heck is that? I'm not a caregiver. Number 2, what happens when adult children who experienced childhood trauma, like a verbally abusive parent, maybe witnessed domestic violence, maybe mom and dad fought a lot and one or the other was violent? What about adult children who grew up in a family with a mental health or a substance use disorder, or a parent who was incarcerated, they were jailed, and later released? These are traumatic situations for children that affect their life, the rest of their life, unless there's some type of mediation or therapy or something to manage through these issues. But the key is, what happens when these children who grow up are expected by the abusing parent to provide care? And then let's look at number 3. What happens when caregivers are expected to take on complicated hands-on or very personal care tasks? When they're asked to commit more time, trade their life priorities to care for this person. Being a caregiver is not easy. The impact of care responsibilities is difficult, if not impossible, to predict, which is why when somebody becomes a caregiver, the impact of care responsibilities is difficult, if not impossible, to predict, which is why until one becomes a caregiver, there's this gap in understanding of truly what caring for another person means and the effects of doing more and more and more. Now, I'll tell you, people who are not caregivers, they don't get it. They find all of these situations impossible to even comprehend. And mostly what they do is they judge caregivers who express frustration or exhaustion, or they judge people like me who give information saying, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. That can't happen. what do you mean this is hard? It's easy. There's no problem, right? Well, that is until one day when they become the caregiver and they realize, holy moly, it's not as easy as I thought. So, one or all of the three situations that I mentioned can result in a lot of emotional stress for caregivers or trauma that does change family relationships, especially if the individuals involved, the caregiver and the care receiver, never had a good relationship, or if they have difficulty initiating and carrying through conversations about planning and how difficult the situation is and the emotional aspects and everything. And then we're also going to throw into this batch of three, how does caregiving affect family relationships, friend relationships, and marital relationships specific to vows and duty and responsibility? Because I have so many people who will say, well, that's the vow you take when you get married. Of course, they're not caregivers yet, right? So they're thinking, well, of course I would take care of my spouse. Of course I would do this. Well, there's a lot of stuff that happens between that wedding day and 20, 30, 40, or 50 years later that might change the way that these people think. So let's begin talking about relationship changes and how these happen. If you have lost a friend or lost contact with a distant family member, you might have noticed one or more of these events occur. And these are simple things that everybody can agree on, right? So your interests changed. You don't have time to go see this friend or, drive 2 hours to see your cousin. Money can be an issue. So if you used to go meet somebody for dinner or a movie or, play, and your income's changed, and now you don't have money to do these shared activities, you either have to find another activity to do, or maybe you don't see that friend as much because they still want to go see movies and do all these activities, and that was the basis of your friendship. So that can change or end a relationship. Then we've got all these, what I call role shifts. So you're dating, you're married, you're having children, your children move out of the house, so you're an empty nester. You are retiring. Maybe you're young and you're building or managing a career. All of these impact the people that we spend our time with and those relationships. And then the game changer really is a change in health. That has the most significant impact on a life. And then as we go through life, sometimes what we don't think about in our families especially is how individuals change. If you have siblings and y'all moved out of the house, what's their life like today versus your life? It could be super different, very, very different. And so maybe you don't have things in common. And just think back, how are you different today from your 10-year-old self or 20-year-old self or 30-year-old or 50-year-old self? What experiences came into your life that might have changed your perspective about how you think about things or the knowledge that you possess? Did you move away from your birth city? What type of work did you pursue? Individual life experiences, the friends that we spend time with, our workplaces, they all affect our identity and who we are. And then look at your parents. How have your parents' lives changed during your lifetime? Their work, their health, their hobbies. And depending on where you were born in the structure of your family, if you were the firstborn or the lastborn or maybe the middle child, all those years that passed, your parents' identities were changing. So your oldest brother may have a very different relationship with your parents than you have with your parents if you are the baby. These things impact caregiving relationships and who is willing to step up to take care of aging parents. And a lot of times we don't even think about these things because we don't know these differences occur and we're not paying attention because we're so busy and life is just going on. So look at yourself. Where do you place your attention? What are your dreams? What are your hopes? What are your expectations? All this can change from year to year. How many of you, thinking back, have lost friendships because of that lack of communication that we mentioned, or maybe you were too emotionally immature at the time to deal with a challenging situation. We can't turn back the clock. Relationships, including friends, family, caregiving relationships, they end or they change for many reasons. And as I mentioned, health changes in the blink of an eye. A heart attack or a hip fracture usually results in that adult child who was just helping out overnight becoming a full-time caregiver. And then all of a sudden, doctors and nurses are calling you the family caregiver. They're placing responsibility and duty on you that you didn't really accept. But you do it because you find yourself in this constant whirlwind of activity. For new caregivers who are trying to do it all, being too busy is that factor that the caregivers ignore until they find themselves isolated and lonely and struggling with life. The daily, weekly, and monthly time committed to caring for a spouse, aging parents, grandparents, or another individual can become all-consuming. And if you're a caregiver who's been doing this for a while, you know this. Friendships and marriages that are relationships that we choose can suffer from a significant lack of where the caregiver places their attention. Now, we're born into our families, and we are born into all these expectations that our cultures put upon us, especially women. Young children obviously need the support of parents who created their lives. But does this mean that this parental choice to have children and the responsibility to take care of the children, in most cases, then transfers to being that child's responsibility later in life to become a caregiver for parents? Is birth and death really about trading time to care for and be cared for? There's no right or wrong answer to that question. Where do individual duty and responsibility enter the picture for becoming as self-sufficient as possible so that a person doesn't need a significant amount of care from somebody else or from a family member, or they have a plan for a different way to get that care? Some adult children who may have seen their parents care for their grandparents don't want to be temporary or permanent caregivers. So instead, they focus on self-independence, and they believe that parents who need care must do their best on their own. There's nothing wrong with that either. Equally, some parents don't want to become a burden on their children with their care needs, so they make plans. It's all a different way of looking at things depending on how you grew up, where you grew up, your parents, your experiences. So again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. So let's begin by looking at how caregiving affects family relationships, and we're going to combine marriage and caregiving because this can answer the number 1 and 3 questions that we started with. One being you're helping out and now you're this overnight caregiver. And then 2 is that caregiver who is expected to do absolutely everything. So before we start this conversation, let's take a short break, and we'll come back to discuss these complicated caregiving situations. Plus, we're also going to talk about what children must know about caring for aging parents who might have been abusive in your younger years. And if you're a parent, are you exposing your children to these situations today? I'm Pamela D Wilson, caregiving expert, advocate, and speaker. Visit my website, PamelaDWilson.com. You can access my online caregiving program, How to Care for Aging Parents, over 160 episodes of this podcast, The Caring Generation, my caregiving library, my book, The Caregiving Trap, and links to my online support group on Facebook. It's called The Caregiving Trap. Stay with me. I'll be right back. This is Pamela D. Wilson, caregiving expert. Check out my website, PamelaDWilson.com, for tips, support, articles, podcasts, online caregiver programs, my online caregiver support, my book, and more. There's something for everyone. Plus, there are hundreds of videos. Actually, I just crossed the 800 mark, answering questions that caregivers ask on my YouTube channel. You can find it by Googling YouTube at Pamela D. Wilson, caregiving expert. So we're back to answering the question of how caregiving affects family relationships, and we're going to specifically talk for a little bit about marriage. If you're married, do you and your partner share common interests or activities? For example, do you prioritize health by eating healthy and exercising? And if so, is this a shared interest by your spouse? Or is your spouse a couch potato who sits on the couch and watches TV all the time and eats bags of potato chips and junk food? Let's take this a step further. Let's use an example of a spouse diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which means they are insulin dependent. And now they have to be more attentive to diet and exercise and really a lot. Diabetes care is a significant effort. So this person who's diagnosed, your spouse, your parent, brother, sister, has to significantly change their habits. So the question is, should the caregiver spouse follow the same recommendations to be supportive? For example, will counting carbs, fiber, protein in food feel like it's a restricted activity? Will giving up a lot of foods that maybe you really like to eat not be something that you want to do? And what would you do if this was a friend in a similar situation and you're not their caregiver? Would you be empathetic and supportive? So in marriages and partnerships, while opposites attract, differences in approaches and beliefs about everything, career, financial management, health, stress management, and self-care, can create these huge gaps over time that really become a chasm when caregiving impacts marital relationships. And when we're talking about spousal and marital caregiving, there's really two types here. There is a spouse or a partner caring for a spouse or a partner, and then enters the picture a married adult child caring for an aging parent. Now, I know many spouses who feel abandoned by their husband or wife who spends all their free time caring for an aging parent. This can create a lot of problems in marriages. If you are a spousal caregiver or a married adult child caregiver, are you giving all your free time to mom or dad? And how has this changed the interest that you shared with your spouse or your partner? Are your priorities the same? Are the new priorities equally important, or are there competing interests? Like one person in a married couple cares for an aging parent, and the other spouse totally feels left out of that relationship because your husband or wife isn't interested in you anymore. They're spending all their time with their aging parent, and there's no time for you. And if you're a spousal caregiver, should you give up all of your personal interests to take care of a spouse? So you're giving up your friends, your activities, your life, all of that. That can be challenging. So the question here is, can beliefs, habits, perceptions be changed to balance out marriage and family and life? Here's a question. How does a neglected spouse get the attention of their husband or wife who spends all their time at the house of an aging parent because that is a huge priority to them? This can be a challenge if that caregiver spouse was in a relationship when they were young where a parent made them feel like they could never do enough, be enough, and they're seeking approval from that parent at the expense of their marriage. Marriages fall apart due to prioritizing care for an aging parent over a husband or wife. Marriages also fall apart after years when one spouse cares for another spouse and the other spouse seems not to care about taking care of themselves or being proactive about their health. And so the caregiving spouse who's donating all this time is like, what the heck am I doing this for? Why am I giving up the rest of my life for this person who clearly does not care? If you're a spousal caregiver, have you discussed what happens when one of you becomes sick or dies before the other? What's the plan for the surviving spouse? Or what happens to the marriage of adult children when a second set of aging parents needs care? Who shows up? What if an adult child or caregiver dies before the person they care for? As a couple, how are you preparing for these complex realities of caregiving that can repeat and repeat and repeat throughout life? Other impacts include age and the life stage of family members. A lot of spouses are very close in age. However, there are always exceptions. There are some marriage gaps of 10 years, 20 years. What is the impact of that when a 60-year-old husband or wife has an 80-year-old husband or wife who needs care? What's the impact of marriage when one spouse retires before the other one who continues to work for another 10 years? That spouse having free time because they're retired may miss the routine of a job, or they may just embrace retirement and they're spending money on personal interests and having a lot of fun. And as a result, that spouse who's still working may become resentful. But then, on the other hand, totally different situation. A spouse who becomes disabled or has health issues has to retire due to these health conditions. And so that income's gone. And the spouse then becomes a financial drain on the family budget. And the working spouse who has to continue to pay all these bills is struggling. Yet the other spouse doesn't really get it. And there's discomfort about saying, well, we may need to sell our house and move somewhere less expensive because I can't continue to pay the mortgage. Or we may need to give up doing this because our expenses have stayed the same, but our income is now 50% less. All of these daily life struggles impact the health and the well-being of the caregiver. If you're single or never married, what's your plan to receive care when you're older? A caregiver said to me the other day, well, I cared for my mother, now I'm caring for my mom's friend. Who's going to take care of me when I'm older? That's a great question. If you're a caregiver, you may know this, you may not, but a loved one diagnosed with one chronic disease like high blood pressure is likely to have more diagnoses, diabetes, kidney disease, other issues. And these healthcare conditions can quickly spiral out of control. Health problems, whether they are physical or mental, impact a lot of things. The ability to earn an income, hold down a job, physically move about, get out of a chair, perform routine life activities, have the social skills to get along with others. So as the caregiver, how are you adjusting your life as a result of caregiving responsibilities, or are you letting all of this take over your life? It does not have to be a one-way street. Think about creating balance so that you can continue participating in activities you enjoy. If you're married, create separate friendships. Have a life outside of this caregiving. Let's talk about expectations for a minute. Stressful situations like needing care or becoming that primary caregiver is highly stressful, especially if there's this expectation that you become the caregiver and now you are the go-to person. You're going to do everything. And on the other hand, you've got all these siblings, brothers and sisters, who are going on with their lives. Now, I don't want to make it sound like caregiving is this doom and gloom thing, because it's not. There are bright sides to being a family caregiver. Caring for another person can result in learning a lot of skills. If you're a caregiver, there's a lot of skills you're going to learn. Bathing your parents, changing catheters, taking blood pressure, doctor appointments, dealing with insurance companies. You'll be surprised. So if you are at this point where you're just helping out and you have come across this podcast, go to my website, PamelaDWilson.com, click on the How I Help drop-down, and look for my online program. It's called Caring for Aging Parents. There you'll find a lot of information on setting boundaries about the time and effort you will contribute to being a caregiver. And if you don't think about this now, years down the road, you may feel like your life has passed in front of your eyes. And if you don't believe me, come into my caregiver group and talk to all the caregivers there who have been doing this for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. I have been in the industry as a professional caregiver for more than 20 years, and I can tell you, boundary setting has been the one thing that has allowed me to help people and not have it affect my mental or physical health. Then, no matter what your caregiving situation, go to my website, request to join my online caregiving group. It's also on Facebook. You can search for it there. It's called the Caregiving Trap. Amazing people there. So when we think of caregiving, it is truly a job. It's not a volunteer opportunity like many people think, and it's an unpaid job. So we are exposed to caregiving throughout our life, but we really don't realize it. So parents are caregivers for their children who are the care receivers. Now, this is very different from caring for an older parent whose health is probably declining and they're not getting any younger or more active like children do, right? Young children are constantly growing, talking, walking, running. They have so much energy that you can barely keep up with them. On the other hand, your aging parents are walking, stumbling, falling, breaking bones. They're sick, and sometimes they're tired all the time. So very different experience, night and day contrast. But the common aspect here that affects whether you will be a caregiver and how you will be a caregiver is the quality of that relationship. So in a perfect world, there is no abuse or what are called adverse childhood events. It's called ACEs. Parents are healthy, they're loving people, everybody's happy. But this really isn't always reality. In some families, parents are verbally abusive to their children. Children witness domestic violence. Parents may have unexplained mental health or substance use disorders that their children have to deal with. Sometimes they are ostracized in school. They're bullied in school because of their parents and what's going on. Some children have a parent who is jailed and later released. These are all very traumatic experiences during the years that children are forming their personalities and their experiences. And these are not forgotten. For some children, these traumas affect them for the rest of their lives in many ways. Health problems, inability to maintain friendships, they can't hold down a job. So here's the thing. If you're a married couple today and you're caring for an aging parent, and you suffered from one or more of these adverse child events, the first question is, how inclined are you to be that caregiver for your parent? You may not want to have anything to do with them. But on the other hand, you may not like your parent, but you feel that you have a duty and a responsibility to step in and do the work no matter how hard it is. If you have children, though, have you considered the effect of this caregiving on your spouse or your partner or your children? What happens if you move this abusive parent into your home? Are you subjecting yourself and your children to more abuse? These are difficult situations, and the wild card in all of this is a diagnosis of dementia, Alzheimer's, a brain injury, or any type of cognitive impairment, because these conditions change a parent's personality. Your sweet, sweet mother or grandmother may act like Linda Blair in The Exorcist. If you haven't seen that movie, you may need to see it to understand what I'm talking about. But it's like you have absolutely no idea who this person is that looks like your sweet mother between 3 and 7 p.m. when mom or dad is sundowning and they're doing all these crazy things. Then all of a sudden they wake up the next morning and they're calling you, oh dear and sweetie, and they're offering all sorts of compliments. It's like you're living with Jekyll and Hyde. Now, if you're not in one of these situations, it's difficult to imagine, impossible to comprehend. And remaining calm in the midst of chaos is extremely important in these situations. Health problems affect family relationships significantly. And I also want to talk about caregivers who may be healthy when you start helping out and then you start suffering one health problem after another. For example, a caregiver told me a few weeks back that he was stressed out and he experienced vertigo. So if you don't know what vertigo is, think back to your younger days when maybe one time you had a little too much to drink and the room was spinning. With vertigo, the world spins and sometimes it doesn't stop for hours. So I asked this caregiver, I said, well, could this episode of vertigo may be related to the stress you're experiencing? And might it be that little tap on the shoulder, that wake-up call saying, maybe it's time to start paying attention to your health before vertigo turns into a heart attack or a stroke, and then you got all these major problems, and you can't be the caregiver anymore. The funny thing about health, and I shouldn't say funny because it's really not funny, but it can and it does change overnight and even hour to hour. Here's an example from my days as a care manager and a guardian for older adults. I was a guardian of this very sweet man, and we'll call him Christopher, and he lived in a personal care home, which is just a small house where 4 or 5 residents live and there's full-time caregivers. And one afternoon I visited and he was fine. He was walking, talking, laughing, no issues. The next morning, my assistant got a call from the care home and said, hey, we need y'all to bring a wheelchair over for Christopher. He can't walk this morning. And I said to my assistant, I said, he was fine yesterday. He was walking, talking. How could this possibly be that all of a sudden he needs a wheelchair? So I had my assistant call back and ask a few questions. I wanted his blood pressure readings, his temperature, his pulse oxygen. I wanted to know if he slept. Did he get up and go to the bathroom? Was he drinking? Maybe he's dehydrated because that can cause delirium. And then all of a sudden, I found out that his temperature was up, his blood pressure was down, his pulse oxygen was down. Christopher really didn't need a wheelchair because he was physically weak. He needed an ambulance and a trip to the emergency room. Now, I give all the credit to the caregiver at the house for making this phone call to say, we need a wheelchair. I think we got a problem. Because in another hour or two, Christopher probably would have been dead. And then the good news is, and this is the other side of caregiving, right? Christopher goes to the hospital. Well, after I fought with the intensive care doctor who told me that Christopher was old and he lived a good life and I should just let him die because that intensive care bed would have been better for a 20-year-old, right? I disagreed with him because I knew better. Christopher would recover. He was given antibiotics and he lived another few years. Caregivers, this is how stuff happens and it's crazy. One day, mom and dad or you're fine. The next day, you're dealing with an out of control, knock down, drag out, up and down roller coaster crisis. So it would really be best if you took care of your health and well-being, or you're not going to make it through 5, 10, 20, or 30 years of caregiving. I know a lot of caregivers who tell me that they don't want to wake up the next morning. Caregiver suicide is a real problem. Never ignore a caregiver or anybody who seems depressed or who's had a behavior change. Ask them what's going on. I have had many caregivers find my videos on my YouTube channel. Again, YouTube at Pamela D Wilson, Caregiving Expert. There's over 800 videos there now answering questions caregivers ask. So many caregivers who were considering suicide in the middle of the night told me that they found one of my videos and that I gave them hope. So if you're having a bad day today, go to my YouTube channel, scroll through a few videos, search for some topics. I do my best in everything I do to tell the straight story with a little bit of humor because caregiving is crazy. You've got to bring humor into it. You've got to look at the bright side because it can be very hard. So let's get back to how does caregiving affect family relationships with aging parents who abused their children and now expect you to give them time, love, and attention. As I mentioned, some children willingly sign up for the task out of duty, or they're trying to, again, regain that approval and that love from their parents that they didn't get as a child. The problem is that this only continues that cycle of abuse. The aging parent continues the abusive behavior or unhelpful habits. They drain the life out of the caregiver. The caregiver's self-esteem plummets. They feel like they can't live on their own, can't make their own decision. They're at a parent's beck and call, especially if they have moved into care for a parent and they've become financially dependent. Why would you do that to yourself? These are generally dead-end situations because then the caregiver is a caregiver 24/7. They can't work. They can't do anything for themselves. They can't make their own choices, right? Because they're codependent on someone else. I know a few caregivers, though, who have had the confidence and the willpower to walk away and say, you know what? I can't do this anymore. It's time for you to make your own care arrangements. Go to a care community or a nursing home. I'm done. I know some spouses who are in similar situations with an abusive spouse that they care for. All of these patterns from earlier in life are really hard to break if you've never gained total independence from a parent or an abusive spouse, if you don't have confidence, if your self-esteem is low. So if you're an adult child caregiver and you were in an abusive situation and you have children, think twice about exposing them to mean grandma or grandpa. Think twice about how these relationships will affect your children and your spouse and you because they weren't good years ago. You think they're going to be any better now? Probably not. If you were subjected to abuse as a child, how did that impact you? Why pass it down to the next generation? It's okay to say, I am not up for this. I will help you find care, but I'm not going to be the caregiver. I will not put myself in this position. I won't do it to myself, my spouse, or my children. And it's also okay to be that spouse who says, I realize you want to care for your mom or dad, but I can't do this with you. I'll support you, but I'm not spending time with them. Boundary setting is critical in all of these three situations to manage how caregiving interactions affect family relationships. So many caregivers tell me that they don't even recognize the person that they are today. They never used to be impatient, intolerant, judgmental, short-tempered, depressed. They never used to be sick all the time. Caregiving stress impacts health. It impacts behaviors. It impacts your mindset for the better and the worse. So before you allow any caregiving relationship to go that far, to affect your health, well-being, career, relationships with your spouse, your children, your friends, seek help. And I know caregivers are the last people who want to seek help, but join an online caregiver support group. Go to Facebook, search for the Caregiving Trap. That's my group. Take an online caregiver course so you know what you're getting yourself into. There's an extensive webinar caregiver program on my website, PamelaDWilson.com. Go to my YouTube channel. Watch a few hundred videos. Come back here to the Caring Generation podcast. Listen to over 160 that are here. Don't wait until the point of no return. Do something for yourself today. I thank you all for continuing to post questions for this podcast and the videos that I share on my YouTube channel. If you're looking for answers to caregiving and aging questions, go to my website, PamelaDWilson.com. You'll be able to access all these programs there, including my caregiving library, my Caring for Aging Parents blog, my book, The Caregiving Trap, and that extensive online, no-charge open course for caregivers. Takes you through the A to Z of caring for elderly parents and yourself. This is Pamela D. Wilson, caregiving expert on the Caring Generation. I look forward to being with you again soon. God bless you all, sending love and light to everyone. Sleep well tonight. Have a fabulous day tomorrow, and enjoy each day until we are here together again.
Tune in each week for The Caring Generation with host Pamela D. Wilson. Come join the conversation and see how Pamela can provide solutions and peace of mind for everyone. Here on Pamela D. Wilson's The Caring Generation.